During the Russian Civil War, at the beginning, you must realize how magical a time it was. It was unbelievably miserable. To think of the living conditions of Russia during the Russian Civil War, I view it as being like everyone's homeless. Imagine that, a world where everyone is homeless, or that the living standards are similar to that of a homeless person. There is this new idea that everything will be collectivized, and in time everyone will work on their own accord without compulsion or out of need or want. There is a spark of heaven in it. It is a very divine thing. The emotional pull is every bit as powerful as a religion. I don't mean to downplay the real anger at the old regime, just that there is also a spiritual side to it, a spirit that is most visible in the earliest days. And the manifestation of this spirit is what came to be known as war communism. What really happened was that Lenin and the Bolsheviks gained power faster than they expected. They gained power in a country not predicted by Marx's revolution. Marx predicted the revolution would come first in Britain or a highly industrialized country like Britain. So it was like a dream, and so they tried full communism right away. It took 3 years to wake up, at least wake up enough to see that communism didn't work from 1918 to 1921. War communism, what became known as war communism, included the following policies. 1. All industry was nationalized and strict centralized management was introduced. 2. State control of foreign trade was introduced. 3. Discipline for workers was strict and strikes were disallowed. 4. Obligatory labor duty was imposed onto non-working classes. 5. Requisition of agricultural surpluses from peasants in excess of absolute minimum for centralized distribution among the remaining population. 6. This is grain confiscation. 6. Food and most commodities were rationed and distributed in urban centers in a centralized way. 7. Private enterprise became illegal. And 8. The state introduced military-style control of railways. That's from Wikipedia right there. Another thing from Wikipedia. Quote, by 1921, heavy industry had fallen to output levels of 20% of those in 1913. 90% of all wages were paid with goods rather than money. 70% of locomotives were in need of repair. And the food requisitioning, combined with the effects of 7 years of war and a severe drought, contributed to a famine that caused between 3 and 10 million deaths. It's quite a range. Coal production decreased from 27.5 million tons to 7 million tons from 1913 to 1920. Of course, that includes the results of the war with Germany at the time. While overall factory production also declined from 10,000 million rubles to 1,000 million rubles. According to the noted historian David Christian, the grain harvest was also slashed from 75 million tons in 1913 to 45 million tons in 1920. Now, certainly much of that had to do with both the Civil War and the war with Germany before that. But it should be noted that the Bolsheviks never came as close to enacting pure communism as they had between 1918 and 1921. All of Marx's theories were that there was to be a revolution, then a slow process involving the dictatorship of the proletariat, which would mold a new socialist man, a term Marx himself never used. He never used the term new socialist man, but that's what he was describing. And doing all this before slowly transitioning into stateless communism, or anarchism. But then, in a burst, the Bolsheviks had it. Their revolution had come, and communism was right there, just beyond a pane of frosted glass. Eyes open, eyes wild. The divine spiritual object of heaven to ring through the ages was right there, so they thrust. Here is communism now, and they thrust, and they broke their hand. Later on, the Soviets would claim the policy was a military necessity. But given the ability of regions loyal to the Bolsheviks and not under Bolshevik control to wage war, and given the ability of the Ufa Directory, the Archangel government, and the Volunteers Army to fight against the Bolsheviks without anything like war communism, and given that there was no such policy of war communism instituted when the Hitlerites invaded 20 years later. Okay, given all of these things, it makes the Soviet story that there was such a thing as war communism dubious. It was an attempt at full communism right away in the dreamlike stupor of Bolshevik victory. Busing is an example of a similar phenomenon. On the way up to the Civil Rights Act, it was assumed that the integration of blacks would take several generations. It would be a long, hard road to integration. Now, of course, I agree. In fact, I would go a step further in that I think the road is infinitely long and infinitely hard. But that aside, the integrationists suddenly had it. They had their Civil Rights Act faster than they expected. Nothing was happening. Nothing. And then, bam, the Supreme Court ruled. And then, bam, ruled again. And then they saw full integration right in front of them. So in addition to banning legal racial discrimination, that is discrimination done by the state, they prohibited private enterprises from racially discriminating as well. And then went a step beyond even that by busing black kids to white schools and busing white kids to black schools to force the integration right away, faster than they had previously said was possible. So we see that similarity in the heat of victory to push, the immediate temptation to instantaneously push way farther than you even, way farther and way faster in a way that goes against your previously stated principles, or your previously stated idea of how things were to progress in the heat of victory, we'll say. So there is that similarity. And that is the point of the video. But I want to digress here, and I want to say that with the Russian people, I can empathize because they faced major hardship in Russia at the time, while blacks in the United States did not. Okay, and their potentials, they had all this potential that was being trapped by the Tsarist regime, whereas black potential was never trapped in the United States. Right? That there was never, black genius was never being held down in the United States. Okay. Moreover, there is a creative energy about communism, a vision of the future that involved real material progress. Right? It was a very, I guess you could say, kind of grandiose, but it was a crystal palace in the sky. There was an idea of something great to be done. What was civil rights about? It wasn't about anything greater. It was about black people becoming economically and behaviorally indistinguishable from how whites are now, or how they were then. Wow, what an amazing thing. Because when that happens, well, virtually nothing changes. Because real changes in living standards come from major technological improvements whose magnitude make the black-white income gap a drop in the ocean. Moreover, with communism, we actually saw massive improvements. We saw the Soviet Union achieve a standard of living greater than that of Bulgaria, Romania, most Asian and Latin American countries prior to 1939, a higher per capita living standard than Yugoslavia or Greece or Turkey, under communism, under frickin' Stalin. The communists had a theory, and in hindsight a stupid theory, but a theory, and this theory when applied, made measurable material progress. They weren't at full communism then. They were still doing the dictatorship of the proletariat and kind of working towards centralized control of the economy. But they were making measurable material progress doing so. Contra libertarians who say central planning can't do anything. The civil rights advocates had no theory, just emotion and an assertion of biological equality, and have never made any measurable material progress towards their tiny, tiny vision of blacks being the social and material equals of whites. Who thinks this way? What kind of person has it as his goal to achieve material parity with someone else? And what kind of group has it as its goal material parity with some other group? It is that rotten, vile little fungus of a man who thinks in such a way. A man who is status conscious or easily impressionable, or a mixture of both.